In this episode, we're going to be talking to Dr. Laura McGuire. Dr. McGuire, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We had the great pleasure of spending yesterday with you and our entire firm and some folks from outside of our firm to go through some trauma-informed training. And I wanted to sort of bring you in the day after, debrief a little bit, learn a little bit more, but also talk a little bit about your background. And so my hope is the first question or the first part of this, we can talk about how we got connected, because I was driving into the office this morning and trying to piece together the dots and connect who was who and who introduced me to when. And I think it had to do with, I think it was Bridie Farrell and Sam Dolch, but I can't remember. What's your memory of how we got connected initially?
Yeah, I remember, I think it was 2020.
Yeah.
And Sam Dolce sent an email connecting us. I think maybe you had seen something that they had posted, because I've done a couple trainings for them. And yeah, the kind of bridge was built, so to say.
And then we spoke, I think in 2020, and I don't remember if it was pre or post, COVID shutdown and the initial one. But this was a long time coming, and so I'm very happy and excited, and I know our team was excited about yesterday, and so I'm hoping to give everybody that's listening a little bit of a preview of that. But I want to know, and I want everyone to understand who you are, so let me read a little bit about your bio, and then we'll talk a little about the National Center for Equity and Agency, okay? So Dr. Laura McGuire is an internationally recognized consultant, survivor, and researcher, and seminarian. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
And author of the book Creating Cultures of Consent, and soon-to-be-released book, The Sexual Misconduct Prevention Guidebook. In 2018, she founded the National Center for Equity and Agency to focus on education, consulting, and training on topics around consent, education, sexual trauma, recovery, and trauma-informed practices. The Trauma-Informed Legal Professional Certification that you've developed, and we actually went through the day course yesterday, is actually the first of its kind, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But tell us about the National Center for Equity and Agency.
Yeah, so I started it in 2018, and the years before, I was working for universities, and then I worked for a military academy. And being someone who has a doctorate in this space is a little bit unusual, particularly because my background is in sexology, which is a very important and very real part of the social sciences, but not a lot of people know about it. We're a kind of small field. And so the perspective that I would bring into prevention and response to sexual misconduct was kind of unique. In particular, I was bringing in a lot of practices on restorative justice and really a holistic response to the intersectional experience of violence, working both with victims and respondents. So people started calling me when I was working at these different institutions, and they'd say, "Can you tell us what to do? Can you help us build a curriculum? Can you give us more guidance?" And it was tough because I was stuck at a physical location. I was geographically limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that the need was out there, and I wanted to be able to go wherever people were requesting support and help. But to do that, I really needed to be on my own and start my own firm. So I left that job. I was in New York at the time on Long Island, and drove back to Florida, where I had lived on and off for many years, and really just took a complete leap of faith. I had no clients. I had no other job. I had a little bit of savings. I had a lot of wonderful support from my mother, my family. But that was it. And so slowly I started to build, okay, what do people really want? Yes, they have these needs, but more specifically, what's the deliverable that they're looking for? And so the first kind of tagline I made for the business was, instead of you build it, they'll come, like what movie is that?
It's
like
the Field of Dreams.
Field of Dreams.
If you build it, they shall come, or whatever he says. Yeah.
Instead of that, I said, you come, we'll build it. That would be the framework for our business. And that's very much how this training came about, and all of our other programs is now companies, industries come to us and say, we love what you're doing here. Could you customize it to our experience? And that's what we do.
I want to go back and do a little bit of a detour because you mentioned sexology, and many people or most people don't know about that study, I think, in detail. So could you describe it a little bit for people who are listening?
Yes. So most times when I say I'm a sexologist, the first response is, whoa, or wow, or is that a real thing? And again, it is. I promise we have conferences. This is a real thing. But it is, at its most basic level, it's the scholarly pursuit of understanding human sexuality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a therapist. Another misconception. I'm in the education and research side, and then there's the therapeutic side. And the other thing people will say is, okay, so you help couples have better sex lives? And yes, that's one subset of the field, the industry. But my focus is sexual misconduct, restorative justice, trauma, and LGBTQ inclusion, as well as things like cultural humility. And there's people who study all different aspects of that and many additional areas. So it's a lot broader than just making people have better sex lives, but that's one goal.
And that launched you into sort of what you've now described, which is this company or entity that really built it in reverse order for most people. A lot of times companies are built or ideas are had, which is, this is the one thing I want to do, and if you like it, great, come to me, and if not, go find somebody else. But I thought it was interesting, and it showed yesterday, which was that you catered your product and your delivery and your content to your audience in a way that we could have digested, and we'll get into it more, but in a way that we digested it. Talk to us about the different fields that you've served in that way.
Yeah, definitely. So, I started out thinking my main audience would be the military, K-12, universities and colleges, right? Because those were the spaces I had worked in and I was more familiar with. But all of these different topics really do have to be so customized and tweaked so that they serve the unique needs of every school or every industry, right? And as we continued to grow, we were getting the most work, the most requests from law firms and attorneys and now insurance companies. And, when I started in 2018, if you had told me that, I would have fallen off my seat and said, what? There's no way, right? And then even in that space, every insurance company, every law firm, every attorney is doing slightly different work. So we really try, even when we have these kind of prepackaged programs, these certification programs, to then further understand that particular client, that particular audience, bring in examples from their work, things that make it really relevant, so that when people are taking this, they're like, this is directly applicable to me. This isn't a broad concept that I have to try to translate and filter for my everyday life. And that's often the problem with certifications in general, but also even workshops and general trainings on trauma-informed care. They're usually tailored for therapists or educators or other folks, and someone else can take it and say, yeah, I get the general idea, that's great. But again, how is this going to look in an email that I would send? Or how does that translate to a conversation that I constantly have with clients? And so making sure that it applies there is where we focus.
Yeah, it brings up a good point, because I think you and I discussed, and I mentioned yesterday to the group, that in going to different conferences and being involved in the National Crime Victim Bar Association and presenting to the National Crime Victim Legal Institute and all these different groups that we're involved with, we oftentimes hear from folks about trauma-informed care, but it's not in the legal context, right? It's from the therapist perspective or from a psychologist perspective or someone that's actually providing that mental health care to a victim or a survivor. But yesterday reframed that in a way that was really effective, I thought, for us. The certification is sort of a different leap, right? So you mentioned that you come to the certification and how you get there is a little bit different. But I'm curious from your perspective, your consumers, we'll call them that, the people that come to you, law firms like ourselves, other businesses, other insurance companies like you mentioned, what's the value that they've communicated to you, that they've received from those certifications beyond just having a conversation about trauma-informed care?
Yeah. I mean, the benefits have been, in one way, not surprising, but in another way, very surprising in all good aspects, right? Because I think what we've seen is that folks take it, and there's kind of a little group of people who immediately come up after and say, oh, this was amazing. I love this stuff. You know, you're preaching to the choir, right? And I often use the phrase, we have to preach past the choir, right? We have to connect to the people who are like, I'm taking this because I was kind of voluntold, but I'm not sure if it's going to really be worth my time, right?
That's a great phrase. Preach past the choir.
Yes. I actually do a whole workshop just called Preaching Past the Choir and the Psychology of Resistance. And so what we see is that those folks are the ones who come back later or talk to the colleagues who are already on board and say, you know, I took it, I heard the messages, I still didn't really buy it. But then the days and weeks and months that followed, it started coming up in my mind. I started seeing the patterns and the behaviors that were discussed. I started thinking about the way I was communicating differently, even with my colleagues, much less with our clients. And it really has changed my life, right? It really has impacted me, not just at work, but as an individual, with my family, in every aspect. And so that's really the goal, right? Is to shift paradigms, not just to make those little micro changes, but to change the way that people are approaching their everyday life and world.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of the law of attraction that a lot of people talk about sometimes, which is, you know, if you want a certain thing, or if you're focused on, you know, you have a car that you want to buy or this or that, you start driving down the road and you start seeing that car. And it's not that it has never been there before. It's just that you're primed for it. And yesterday, at least for me, primed me in a way to start thinking about the interactions that I've had with other people, other clients, even staff members and coworkers and partners, in a way that I suspect that's what you hear down the road, which was, you know, a week, 2 weeks, a month, a year down the road, you have people coming back to you and saying, you know, not sure if I was totally bought in at the time, but after I was triggered or primed to be able to see these interactions, I started seeing them all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
During the process or yesterday's training, which was a full day, it was phenomenal, and we got a good little lunch in between. You talked about de-escalation, and I want to ask you a little bit about de-escalation. And why don't you first talk about just context so that the listeners know what we're talking about when we say de-escalation?
Yeah, so de-escalation is working with people who are having an explosive response, which means they're angry, right? They're yelling, they can be physically aggressive, maybe waving their arms, getting in someone's face. And if you are working with people in any kind of traumatic situation, you will deal with folks who are having that kind of response. So knowing how to deal with that effectively, both internally for yourself and for that person that you need to help navigate the situation, is really crucial.
The interesting thing that came to mind when I was thinking about de-escalation is sort of, at least what I've observed in our practice, is that escalation is almost cascading, or can be cascading, right? And we can have clients, as you know, we represent a lot of sexual abuse survivors, but even beyond that, we have all of our clients, most of them have experienced some form of trauma, one form or another, and we learned about that yesterday and all the different types of trauma that there are. And as a result of that, our team has that secondary trauma that we talked about, and we have our own triggers that we don't quite fully understand probably in most contexts. And what I've observed is that sometimes we can have a client who goes into that moment, right? Whether because of uncertainty or fear or anxiety or whatever it may be is escalated, angry, responsive, and then that triggers a response within sort of the team, right? The paralegal who's on the phone, the attorney that's talking to them, because then they want to be protective of themselves. What have you heard? What's your experience with that in terms of, I'm sure someone else has come to you before and said, hey, how do I deal with de-escalation when I'm trying to de-escalate myself and my team, but we're also trying to de-escalate a client, a survivor who's also, going through this experience?
Yeah, it's so common. It's so common. And I think people need to have awareness that having a visceral response to either someone breaking down crying or screaming is very natural. It's very normal, right? It doesn't mean you're not good at your job. It doesn't mean that you're not handling things well. But what we want to do is give people tools for resiliency so that they can navigate those moments the best possible and so that they can stay in the field long term. Mm-hmm. The people who burn out the most, especially in those moments, are the people who are actually the best at their work, right? Because they're empathetic, because they do take things in, because they really are paying attention to what this person's going through. But that stress load is so much heavier for them, and they're like, I just can't do this anymore. And that's terrible, because we really need them to stick around. So things we can do, number one, is just have that basic foundation of how do you de-escalate, right? And it's really the exact same practices that we talk about with any aspect of trauma-informed care. It's really listening to the person. Angry people don't feel heard. That's why they raise their voice. You're not listening to me. Maybe if I scream, you will, right? So mirroring back to them, I do hear you. This is hard. I can see how this is impacting you. You're not alone in this. And then giving them options. Again, anger comes from a feeling of helplessness. So we can do this right now, or we can do that. And the outcome you'll have to deal with, right? So maybe it's, I do need us to take a breath. I do need us to lower our voices. And they might say, I'm not going to do that. I don't care. Okay, well, then we're going to need to take a break because I can't hear what you're saying right now when you're speaking in that tone. But first, affirming the feelings, then giving them options so they feel empowered. I am not taking power away from you. Here are the different paths we can traverse together. Mm-hmm. You decide. And then oftentimes we'll see things start to come down. But then there's the residual effect, which you just talked about, right? Which is, okay, the clients calm down, you leave the room, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. I'm so stressed out, right? You go home, you're short with your family, your friends. You're like, I don't want to talk to anyone. People have been yelling at me all day. And so you have to have those resiliency tools in place, right? Number one, among colleagues, affirming and acknowledging that was really hard. That wasn't fair. You didn't do anything wrong. That person is dealing with their own stuff and you were a safe space for them to take it out on. How can we support you in this moment? And then making sure that they have, things like coverage for paid time off, access to therapy and their benefits, even having a therapist that, is on call for firms. And one of the companies that we work with, they have that as a regular benefit, even for family members of the person who's connected to the business. And those things are really impactful, they sound small, but making sure they're in place and reminding people they're in place in those moments. Remember, you can access this whenever you want. Do you want me to help you get an appointment set up right now? I know you're shaking. This is really hard. Doing things like breathing exercises together. Again, sounds silly, but if you want people to have very long, sustainable careers where they remain emotionally vulnerable and open so they can be really effective in their roles, these are the things you have to put in place.
You brought up a point about affirming or affirming that you're listening, and that in making a distinction between I'm listening but I can't hear you, which was interesting to me. Could you sort of put a finer point on that, on the difference, or how you communicate to somebody that there's a difference between I'm listening but I can't really hear what you're saying because of sort of the noise in between, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, again, it begins with reflecting back to this person, here's what I hear you're saying, right? And they might, for example, say, things are not going the way that I asked them to go. Why aren't you doing your job? Right? And you're like, I am so doing my job. You don't know all the things that I'm doing to try to make this happen, right? And so we become defensive. We have our emotional reaction. They're more angry because they're like, you're not even caring. You don't know how this is impacting the rest of my life, on and on, right? So saying, yeah, I see how this is impacting your life. I can only imagine how difficult this must be. And, they might say, I can't even function at work. That must be terrifying. I know I worry about losing my job, going through this and having to navigate, right? Just having that conversation, right? But then if they're still being explosive, saying, I really want to hear you and respond to you effectively, but right now, when we're being angry or our voices are raised, it's really hard for me to take in authentically what you're communicating to me. So can we take a break? Can I get you some water? Can we take a few breaths together, right? And they might laugh and say, I know it's silly, but let's just try it, right? Yeah. And their vagal system will be activated. And then you can start to have that better conversation. And they will also start to trust you differently. Like, oh, you can handle me at my worst. And you can bring me back down or up the ladder, as we call it in polyvagal theory. And you're somebody I really want to work with and connect with because you are hearing me and seeing me.
You used a phrase that was, I can only imagine what you're going through. And it reminds me when we're picking juries as lawyers, and this is sort of down the road, not really client interaction, but I just came out of a trial that involved very sensitive issues that had to be asked to jurors in jury selection to try and understand if they, when seated on the jury and started listening to the evidence, if they would be too triggered or wouldn't be capable or feel like they would have some resistance to being able to look at images, to being able to absorb the information in a way that was objective and fair to both sides, right? And one thing that came up and comes up a lot in our world down the road is this reveal unexpectedly of a juror's prior trauma as a response to a certain question in jury selection. And I give you that background because there's a lot of talk, I think, within the trial lawyer community about how do you respond to that? How do you respond to a juror saying, I just lost my mother a week ago and I just don't know that I can really give this case my full attention. Or, I'm actually a survivor of domestic violence or sexual abuse myself, and I'm concerned that if I get involved in this case, then I won't be able to separate my experience with the experiences that I'm being asked to judge. And your wording was that I can only imagine what that was like. And you mentioned something yesterday, which was, don't say, I know exactly how you're feeling, which I think is sometimes the response that a lot of people want to give. I know how you're feeling. I know that's hard. And talk to me about that, because it to me, when you mentioned it yesterday and you just talked about it now, it has application to clients and interaction with our clients and survivors sort of behind the scenes, but also has application when we're in a courtroom and the lights are on and everyone's looking at us and trying to say, is this person going to be empathetic and sympathetic to somebody revealing their trauma, or are they just, going to blow past it or lose that connection with the juror because they're saying, I know exactly how you're feeling. Don't worry. I've been there, done that. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah. That's a great question. So as far as things to say and not to say, we often tell folks, don't say, I know exactly how you feel. Even if you've been in a very similar situation, we're intersectional beings, right? We have all these layers of identity and experience, and no two people are exactly the same. So we'll never know for sure how someone else is experiencing something, even if we can relate. But we do want to tell people that we're empathizing. And empathy is different than compassion, right? Compassion is, I want to try to find a solution for you. And that sounds awful. And let's focus on, again, some kind of end goal. Empathy is, I'm electively going to sit with you in this moment, in this feeling. And that is so much more healing and so much more profound, right? Because oftentimes we don't even necessarily need someone to solve something immediately. We just need them to hold space for what we're carrying and carry it with us for a moment. And so to say, I can only imagine, right? And I'm trying to imagine. I'm trying to sit and think, if I had walked in your shoes, if I had lived your life, how this would be impacting me. But I'll never know for sure because there's so many layers to that I can't access. So then talking about jury selection or even hiring attorneys or paralegals, right? Anyone who's going to interact with these stories. There's a couple of things I would suggest there. One is you do want to look for people who have some kind of signs that they are empathetic in general, right? And that can be things like they're happy when someone's happy, right? Someone says good news and, oh yeah, that's so great, versus like, that's nice for you. Or when they see someone who's upset, right? They have that immediate response of being upset as well. What's going on? I don't even need to know, right? But I'm upset with you. How can I be here for you? And then it's also giving people that permission, that grace of being able to opt out of certain situations, right? Because again, even as professionals, we might say, this particular person, situation, etc., is too triggering for me. It hits too close to home. It brings up too many memories, right? And to have that ability to consent, right? We talk about consent in all interpersonal interactions, to say, I can't serve on this jury. I thought I could. They asked me the questions and it seemed fine, but there are things that were embedded deep in my hippocampus, right, that I didn't remember fully, and now they're coming back, and I need to opt out now. I said yes, but that yes has ended. And then same thing again for the people we're working with, that they can say, I thought I could take on this case. I thought I had moved past things in my childhood or in years gone by, but I'm realizing it's not okay for me and I'm really suffering. So can I delegate this to somebody else? And making sure they feel safe in doing that.
Yeah, there's two sort of comments that I have about that, which is in the case we just tried that had some sensitive issues. I think with the court we addressed that we felt it was important to have several alternative jurors or alternate jurors for a week or so long trial. So we had 4, sort of with the idea that there may be a moment in time where, obviously there are things that happen in life and unrelated to the trial, but there also may have been a moment in time where someone, taps out, says, I can't, the substance of this, I thought I could handle, but I can't anymore. And that's sort of, I think, is aligning with what you're saying about this rolling and continuing to check in on consent, which is even for our jurors, are we going to give them an opportunity through relief of others within the community if we can sit more than the number you need to decide a case so that they can tap out if they feel like they get to that point. And the same thing with cases. I think our firm, we talked about this yesterday in terms of the varying different types of cases and clients that we serve, all within the injury space, but it can range from people who have lost a loved one in a wrongful death case, or somebody who is dealing with sexual abuse and a survivor, and we're going after a church or a hospital or a doctor or whoever may have caused that to try and get right those wrongs. But I think internally, it makes me feel good that I did this, even not knowing your training. I would always check in with my team and say, hey, we've got this new case. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Right? Or can you handle this one, not just workload-wise, but substantively? Is this too close to home for something that I may not know? Because we don't know everything that's under the surface. So that's very helpful, I think, to the listeners who are hopefully applying some of this. You talked in your presentation, or we talked just now. No, here this is what I wanted to, this is the thing I thought about before we sat down, and I thought about it when you were first talking, and I wrote it down, about improving listening. And one of the exercises that we went through was thinking about moments in time where we felt like we were heard or that we were hearing somebody well, and what elements were involved and how did we know. And then also, when were you not? When's an experience when you weren't listening, when you may have been disassociated on that ladder or for whatever reason? What are tools, because it happens with everybody, what are tools that you think legal professionals or any professional could use when they're in that moment where I know I need to be locked in? I know this is an important moment for my client. This is an important moment for this witness that I'm talking to or whoever it may be. But for whatever reason, I don't feel present in that I'm hearing this person. What are tools that you would recommend to try and implore to get in that moment?
Yeah. We all as human beings have struggles with communication. It's the number one reasons that companies fall apart and the number one reason that relationships fall apart, right? Lack of communication. And part of that is our ability to listen effectively. So sometimes we think, well, of course I know how to hear people, right? I talk to people every day. But it really is a skill we have to hone and practice and think about. So one thing I would say, like you just mentioned, okay, this is a really pivotal moment. Switch that framework in your mind to every single interaction is a pivotal moment, right? Because we might say, I'm not getting them ready for a deposition. This is just a casual conversation on the phone. This isn't that big of a deal. But every interaction with you is a huge deal to the survivor. And so if we go in with that kind of perspective, right, we're really then being more mindful of, am I present right now? Or am I thinking about the checklist that comes with what I'm hearing? Or am I thinking about the other emails that I have to answer, right? And when we notice that, simply just bringing yourself back into the present. If there's anything you missed, saying, can you please clarify for me? I think I heard you say this, but I want to make sure I understood it correctly, right? And then might be able to expand even more on what you brought up. And the other huge thing is body language, right? And with technology, this is one of the issues we have with communication. We don't hear prosody, we don't hear tone, and we can't read each other's body language. I do restorative practice advisement for mediations. And this is one of the things we really talk about there too, is when opposing sides are talking to each other, particularly restorative justice is more one-sided. We're letting the survivor be heard in a way that they haven't felt before. And so the respondents need to really check their body language, right? Are they having this defensive stance, right? Are their shoulders forward? Are they looking all over? Are they looking down? Or are they making sure that they are showing, I'm receptive. I want to take in what you're telling me and really synthesize it with maybe misconceptions I've had about this situation or how my behaviors have caused harm. And so, again, those are things we have to teach.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily get that growing up. Some of us, I think, are more primed for it, and a lot of us are the people who then get into this work, right? Because this is easier for us. But we have to especially work on the folks who have a harder time with empathy and listening and responding.
It brings up, I've given a presentation before about how you ask questions. And the joke I make is that we go through law school, lawyers at least, go through law school, and the general public thinks that there's like some class about how to ask a great question or how to craft a question or how to do this. And really there's not, right? A lot of it is how much are you willing to sort of study that area of cognitive science or even just that area of the law and listen and see what works and what doesn't work. But it seems consistent with what you're saying, which is these seem like things that we should know naturally or just through normal educational circumstances that get us to either where we are as lawyers or where therapists are or where doctors are, but it's really not embedded from what I understand. This trauma-informed care, it's really not embedded in a way in our educational system to really teach us this.
Right.
And I think we talked before about what the value you feel is, not just we talked about the value of consumers, people that come to you, our law firm, other firms that have gone through this training, but what would you say to somebody who's looking for a lawyer, a survivor, somebody who is looking to hire a law firm to represent them in a situation that is traumatic not just what they went through, but as we talked about yesterday, even the process can be traumatic of going through the litigation or the legal system. What are your recommendations to that?
Yeah, that is why I created this, right? It started out at least that way. I am a survivor and I was trying to find representation and having really negative experiences, right? Even sometimes I'd have a great initial consult, but then as soon as I started working with the attorney, it was totally different, right? It was very cold. It was very mechanical. I was confused. I was overwhelmed. They were like, too bad, deal with it. I'm busy. And so I said, okay, how do we change this, right? Because like you're saying, I think most attorneys in 2022, when we're recording this, have some general exposure to trauma-informed care as a concept, right? They go in, they hear a talk, they're like, yeah, okay, be more sensitive, be more emotionally intelligent, got it. But I thought there has to be some other level to this and a differentiator so that fellow survivors can seek these individuals out nationally. And, again, talking to crisis centers around the country, oftentimes people come in and they're advised you do need representation, and they ask the victim advocates, who do I go to? Or they ask their therapist, who should I talk to? And they might throw around some names, but there's no one, again, who set themselves apart as committed to this practice. And so that's, again, where certification comes in. It also is another kind of level of safety and security for the survivor that this person doesn't just have awareness. They've taken this on as a certification, so there's a code of conduct, right? They can look that up and say, okay, these are the kinds of things this person's going to deliver. They are committed to listening to me. They are committed to understanding my experience and to making sure that to the best of their ability, they're bringing that to our interactions each time we have to meet. And hopefully, we create this network of attorneys and firms who are set apart, and it's not going to be for everybody, right? Because some folks are going to say, oh, this touchy-feely stuff, it's not for me, or I'm not good at that, and so if I pretended I was, I'd be doing them a disservice. But to at least have those individuals say, yeah, I want to know this, understand this, and apply it in a daily way.
Yeah, it's almost as if people are looking for it, hopefully that they can actually find it somewhere. And that sort of brings me to the question of what's your vision, right? You mentioned sort of this network of lawyers, but what do you hope comes from either the continued trauma-informed training of lawyers in law firms or the expansion or growth of the National Center for Equity and Agency? What do you envision the future looks like for you and for our field?
There's a couple of dimensions to that, right? So one would be that, yes, we get a whole network of attorneys and insurance companies and colleges and K-12 teachers and all these different spaces that say, I want to be the person that works with survivors, right? I want to have these different approaches and I want to be known for that. And then that survivors, again, even a child, a parent of a survivor can say, I know that I want this person to be their teacher because they've taken this extra step. I want my child to go to this school because their Title IX coordinator has this kind of level of commitment. And if I need an attorney, this is the person I know I can go to. I can look up this database and find that individual. And hopefully then we build this network where, again, things shift and judges start taking these kinds of certifications and people start working with each other and having collaborative conversations and saying, hey, we're all committed to this. We all are held to this code of conduct, these practices and principles. Let's work together, right? Because we agree to these things. Again, this comes into the mediation room. This comes into informal resolutions, all those different spaces. The other thing that I want to see change is that when people are getting into industries, they have this offered to them as part of their education. So I would love to see every law school in the country say, this isn't required, but we'll cover it or we'll subsidize it. We want a certain number of students to be going into practice certified as trauma-informed legal professionals. And then for those people to be able to find firms that have also taken it and say, I know I'm not only going to be supported in providing this kind of care to clients, but I'm also going to receive it, because that's a huge part of the certification.
Right.
And honestly, that's something I didn't think of when I first created it, when it was first formulating. Initially, it was attorneys reaching out saying, do you have something about how to approach our clients differently that's customized to us? But then in further conversations, they were saying, do you know in some states on the back of our bar card, there's a number to our local Alcoholics Anonymous?
Yeah.
They're like, we really struggle with our mental health. And I said, that's so important. Thank you for telling me that, because that's something, again, we often talk about with therapists, social workers, teachers. We can absolutely add that in, right? And again, creating those workplace cultures that exhibit those kinds of practices, it's not only great in the theoretical or in the emotional aspect, but also to your bottom line. You're going to have more retention of clients. You're going to have more referrals. You're going to have less turnover. You're going to have higher employee satisfaction. It's going to be easier for you to get the people who are coming out of schools that you really want, right? It makes you stand out as the place people want to be.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of a plug as we wrap up, which is I expected, I think yesterday, and you had a little checklist of, did it meet expectations, did it exceed expectations? And I said both, because I felt that it met and exceeded my expectations as it relates to tools and tactics and strategies and ways to better communicate with clients who are survivors and clients who are going through all forms of trauma, which we learned about. But sort of the added bonus that I wasn't necessarily expecting, but that almost was equal in value to me of yesterday, was the recognition and ability to learn how to manage the trauma within the walls of our own office, and hearing coworkers and partners talk about, hey, this is sort of how I deal with resiliency, and here's what takes away my spoons. We talked about the spoon exercise, and for me, I was sitting in the back of the room and observing, but also just taking down notes. The value of being able to understand, okay, not only is this, how can we address this with our clients, but when our team members are going through their own trauma or are triggered by something, an interaction with a client, how can we serve them? And not just serve our clients, but be able to serve everybody within this sort of network. And we talked, I think, at the very beginning about servant leadership and what that looks like. And for me, it sort of came full circle. So I want to recognize you and appreciate you for coming. It was incredibly valuable, I know, to me. And yesterday we had a nice little get together afterwards that you got to enjoy with some of the team. And when I stopped by, everyone was ranting and raving about it. So. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for providing this service. I think it's going to go to the moon, and I think it's going to be incredibly valuable for anyone who chooses to take the course and to undergo the certification. But I'm sure that someone's listening and may want to find you somehow. So how can somebody find you or follow you? Email, social media? What's the best way for somebody to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so hopefully people will reach out. And again, even if they have just questions or thoughts or suggestions, I love hearing from all kinds of folks. You can find the firm through equity and agency, all spelled out, .com. And you can find me at drdrlauramcguire.com. You can email me, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, all those good places. So feel free to reach out, and hopefully we can change the world together.
Perfect. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.